So Maverick Christian, what a name. Well done, Maverick Christian. Is asked the question, why did practically every expert get it wrong on the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Yeah, and not that I'd call myself an expert, but me too. And I think it's that question we addressed at the beginning, was that we're kind of thinking in terms of Putin being a rational actor, and he was getting everything he wanted by saber rattling and by sort of throttling Ukraine and getting all of that sort of Western attention, which he wants. He wants to be reminded that Russia was a great power and a big player in the world and all of that. And it seems unthinkable that he would want to launch all-out war. It still seems unthinkable. I'm like Konstantin said, it's like, you know, you almost wake up, it's like a dream. It's mad. That said, there were enough voices amongst the sort of intelligence community and so on who'd seen various briefings, and I mean, I listened retrospectively actually earlier this week. I listened back to a podcast, American intelligence community podcast, which had 3 or 4 commentators on there, and they all differed. I mean, they all say, "Oh no, I don't think he's going to invade because he's getting what he wants." That argument that I gave, and this predated the invasion. And 2 of them said he wasn't going to invade, and 2 of them said he was. So there were voices that were saying, you know, the intelligence is such that, you know, this is not a drill. So there were voices there that were saying that. But as I said, I think the rest of the world just assumed that, you know, he was effectively irrational.
Oh, like if you actually look at Putin's history, former head of the KGB, you look at, you know, the case of Alexander Litvinyenko, you look at the poisonings in Salisbury. This isn't a man who values human life very highly, particularly if it means that he can eliminate them in order to get what he wants.
But again, this is, I'm sorry to, you know, say this with you there, Konstantin, but this is kind of also an element of the Russian psyche.
100%.
You know,
I don't want people to be under any doubt about what you're saying.
Yeah,
it's 100% true. I mean, you've got to understand, this is a country that killed 20 million of its own citizens only 70 years ago, or 80 years ago, whenever it was.
And you go to, I mean, the thing that always surprises me in a way is you go to any of the Red Army's cemeteries. Like there's 3 in Berlin, right, from the Battle of Berlin in 45. The biggest one in Treptower Park, which is spectacular, sort of monuments and all sorts
gigantic.
of things. But they're mass graves. Like they're mass graves of 5,000 people each in each of these mass graves, right? So the idea of the individual, and they're not repatriated. I mean, the way that Americans repatriate their dead from war as a matter of routine, Russians don't do that, right? Not only do they not do that, they put them into mass graves. So there are no names, right? We don't know who they are, which to a Western mind, with all of its individualism and all of that, is kind of, it's completely anathema. It's kind of, wow, that's punchy, you know. That's just the way it works. It's the way it worked in 45. It's the way it works now.
And that comes direct from the Soviet lens, doesn't it? Where the individual is not important.
That's much older than that.
I think it goes way back.
Oh, really?
It's much older than that.
Much older, yeah.
And so
I think you can see this in
the long, hard winter.
Yeah, I think you know, man is, the individual is kind of expendable. And there are greater goals to be had, and we get them by moving together. And if the individual falls off the side, then so be it. It's that classic kind of, you know, communitarian mentality that the community is everything, the individual is nothing.
There's another piece to it as well, which is Russia's a massive country, and because of that, logistically, it was very difficult to govern. And what you therefore needed is very strong central leadership to prevent the regions from becoming, you know, mini tsardoms in which the local uppity king would do whatever he wanted. And because of that, this is the anecdote I always use to explain this, to try and explain this to people, is one of the huge names in Russian history is, of course, Ivan the Terrible. He's not called Ivan the Terrible in Russian. It's not an inaccurate translation. This is a man who killed his own son in a fit of rage, who, as a kid, tortured animals, who did all sorts of atrocious things. In Russian,
textbook psychopath.
Textbook psychopath. In Russian, he's called Ivan the Fearsome, and revered.
Yeah.
Stalin has a higher approval rating in Russia today than Joe Biden has in America or Boris Johnson has in this country.
Yeah.
That's the mentality. And nobody in the West can understand this because you can't. You can't. If you operate under the Western moral framework, it's impossible to understand people who would bury 5,000 soldiers who secured victory in the deadliest war in the history of humanity in a mass grave. You can't imagine that.
Yeah.
And
a way out.
that's what I've been arguing.
Right?
Yeah.
And that probably means, I think, in an ideal world, they carry on the negotiations, which I think have been rather kind of cynically led, particularly on the Russian side so far. That's a ruse to buy time, reorganize, whatever it is. But anyway, at the moment, those negotiations, in an ideal world, you might see Ukraine being able to fight them effectively to a standstill, or make the costs so great that Putin is ready to make some sort of deal. And I think the best they could probably achieve from the Ukrainian perspective is a return to status quo ante. Right? So you can have Donetsk, Luhansk, you can have Crimea, but Ukraine is allowed to exist. Now, whether it can exist with an independent sovereign government is a quite open question, but that's what it should demand, right? I think anything else is kind of, requiring it to be in a sphere of influence, pandering to Russian paranoia is a hollow victory. So for the Ukraine, so that's an ideal scenario. I think that's about as good as it's going to get. The other side of the spectrum, the realistic side of the spectrum, is, I think, the destruction of Ukraine and occupation of Ukraine, which is going to be bloody. And Ukraine's democratic ambitions, its ambitions to join the Western world in general, are going to be put back by decades. So it's very dark. We're in a very dark place at the moment, and this is why I say this is Cold War II. We can't afford, I don't think, the West to whatever happens in Ukraine, when it's over, go back to some pretend normal, because that would not be acceptable, and it would be a betrayal of all of those brave Ukrainians who have fought like they have, with that ambition of fighting for their sovereignty and their freedom, and to decide their own future. If we then carry on business as usual, Wandel durch Handel, there's a betrayal of them, and that shouldn't happen. So, we do need to carry on that fight.
Do you think the West, I mean, we've all been surprised in the last week by the resolve of the West, but do you think if Ukraine is overrun, Russia annexes the eastern and central part or installs a puppet government, do you think the West has the appetite to maintain these sanctions in perpetuity?
I hope so. Honestly, I hope so. And as I say, I don't think we can, in all conscience, go back to business as usual and sort of normalization, because you'd have in effect, a regime like Lukashenko in Belarus, in Ukraine. I think that's probably the most likely outcome, which is horrible to say. And to me, that is a tragedy for Ukraine, and it's something that we should carry on, carry the torch effectively for the freedom of Ukraine, and certainly bolster our defenses on that eastern frontier. Poland has to make, realize that it's a frontier country now, which I said that last week. Prior to the invasion, it already has felt that way with Belarus and with the manufactured migrant crisis of a few months ago. But Baltic states, Poland, you know, all those NATO members on the eastern fringe of Europe, we have to make sure that that is an inviolable line, that no step further.
But that means putting NATO troops on the ground.
That means putting troops there, absolutely. Absolutely.
Isn't that going to be seen as an antagonistic gesture?
Yeah, I think we're past that now.
I think we're way past that.